Hi, I'm Mim Warden, and I have the honor of being chair of the Friends of the Burke Library. The Burke Library, one of the libraries of Columbia University, and located here on this campus, in case you're not familiar with it. I see a lot of faces that I haven't seen at other ones, so that's why I'm want to give you all the information you need. In a moment, we'll be hearing from the boss, the director of the Burke Library, but I just want to give you a heads up that we do have copies of the new newsletter. If you didn't get one in the mail, that means you probably are not on our mailing list. And we would love for you to be on the mailing list because we intend to keep creating this kind of newsletter. And if we have your email address and or your mailing address, we can be sure that you get this information. And interestingly, in talking to people here, it seems that many of you did get the information from either the newsletter or the website. Could I see hands as to how many came by way of the website? Thought so. Thank you. We really appreciate it. We have one other item that may interest you. The Burke Library is the repository of some wonderful ancient books and manuscripts, and from them, some years back, we started selecting images that could be on a Christmas card. So these are images from the collection at the Burke Library. And if you're interested in starting your Christmas cards early, they are for sale there at the table, and we can help you with that at the end of the lecture. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. John Weaver, the director of the Burke Library.
Thank you, Mim. Many of you know, not all of you know, how much Mim Warden has meant to the Friends of the Library over the past years. And will you please join me in expressing our appreciation to her for all the work that she and the Friends have done for the Burke Library. Thank you, Mim. I just also want to briefly mention that Seth Caston is here tonight. He's the reference librarian. He's been at the Burke Library for 37 years as a reference librarian. Seth, would you please just stand so our audience can... And we celebrate Seth's career because he retires this year after a long and full career. And we hope that he'll continue in his role as an assistant, an advisor at the Burke Library. It's such a delight to have you here. As I went around and met you, I realized this is a very diverse audience representing much of the diversity of New York City. And we had expected that, a topic like this, the World Missionary Conference. You look at the annals of modern church history, of the growth of world Christianity and modern Christianity. There are few moments in the history which are as significant as the World Missionary Conference in 1910. Of course, this lecture is a celebration of the 100-year anniversary of that conference in Edinburgh in 1910. There are few locations in the world where the study of that event can occur in such a fulsome way as at the Burke Library. The Burke Library, as you may know, holds the records of the Missionary Research Library, which holds the records of the World Missionary Conference. And so Brian and others have come to the Burke Library from around the world to study this seminal moment in 20th century Christianity. There are few scholars who are as qualified, I would argue none who are qualified to speak about the World Missionary Conference as Brian Stanley. It's indeed an honor for me to introduce Brian. Dr. Stanley is the professor of world Christianity and the director of the Center for the Study of World Christianity at the University of Edinburgh. Previously, he worked at the Henry Martyn Center for the Study of Mission and World Christianity at Cambridge. Dr. Stanley, as he says, is a Cambridge man. He earned his PhD there in history, his dissertation on the domestic base of the early Victorian missionary movement. I think, as the title suggests, he is first and foremost a historian that has, through the course of his career, worked at a variety of different theological institutions, of different denomination, ecumenical certainly in service scope, from Baptist to Anglican to Reformed to Methodist. He served in a variety of different institutions. He's taught courses on world Christianity, the theology and history of world mission, contextual theologies, modern British and American church history, and ecumenism. But if you drill down, you see what he really focuses upon. It's on this topic, the World Missionary Conference, Edinburgh, in 1910. And ancillary and contextual topics, the history of Protestant missions from the 18th to the 20th century, modern global evangelicalism, and the transition in the early 20th century from race to culture as a category for describing and interpreting human difference. In 2009, Eerdmans published a book by Dr. Stanley entitled The World Missionary Conference, Edinburgh, 1910. I've read the book and would agree with the words of another reviewer who recently wrote about the book that the book is a reliable and indispensable guide to the original event. Another reviewer observed, "It's a fascinating study and a good starting point for reflection on the subsequent shift in Christianity's center of gravity away from the West, not least thanks to the missionary movement and where it might go next." We look forward to hearing about that movement and where it might go next tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stanley.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for coming on a cold night. Winter seems to have suddenly arrived in New York. Thank you, Dr. Weaver, and thank you to the Friends of the Burke Library for their very kind invitation and for the great honor of delivering the Friends of the Burke Library lecture for 2010. As Dr. Weaver has said, the library is a rich and still to some extent, I think, undiscovered treasure trove for historians of Protestant missions, ecumenism, the growth of world Christianity. Certainly, I couldn't have written my book without considerable time in the Burke Library, or if I had, it would have been a very much poorer book. So I'm enormously indebted to the seminary and to the library for the hospitality they provided, and so this is one way of saying thank you to the Burke Library for the enormous contribution it made to the book. And although I don't think she's here, I would like to thank especially Ruth Tonkis Cameron, the archivist, who's been unfailingly helpful throughout my research, and all of her staff, and Seth in particular. They've always been a great source of support. So thank you. Well, 100 years on, how should we remember the World Missionary Conference? Should we venerate it as the formal beginning of the institutional ecumenical movement, as the first step along the road that led to the formation of the Church of South India in 1947, and 1 year later in Amsterdam to the opening assembly of the World Council of Churches? Well, the origins of both the Church of South India and the WCC, as is well known, owe a great deal to the impetus supplied by the Edinburgh Conference. But we need to remember that Protestant ecumenism in a missionary context had already taken institutional shape, certainly in North America and in much of Europe well before 1910. While in both China and India, indigenous Christian leaders and missionaries were already engaged in serious discussions about structured forms of missionary cooperation. In China, a committee to discuss Protestant church union was formed as early as November 1902. The Shanghai Centenary Missionary Conference of 1907, though not yet ready to commit itself to the goal of a united church, recommended the formation of a federal union of all Protestant churches in China. So it didn't all suddenly begin at Edinburgh in 1910. Nevertheless, the misconception that Edinburgh 1910 somehow marked the genesis of the ecumenical movement rather than a major milestone in it has survived tenaciously here and there, even throughout this year's centennial commemorations. Equally, I think it also remains necessary to reiterate the rather obvious point that the Edinburgh Assembly was a conference of missionary society delegates convened to talk about missionary problems. It was not a conference of delegates of churches convened to discuss church unity. The problem for many of us, I suspect, is that the more we focus on Edinburgh 1910 as what it was, a missionary event, the more embarrassed we become. For it was overwhelmingly white and Protestant in its delegate composition, entirely unashamed in its acceptance of Western colonialism, and unambiguously committed to the now unfashionable view that Christianity was destined by divine fiat to the eventual conquest of all other world faiths. What I intend to do this evening is to analyze an aspect of the conference that I hope may yield some fruitful insights for reflection on Christian witness in today's very different world, namely, how perceptive and how accurate was the conference in its reading of the signs of the times, and hence in its deduction of appropriate priorities for the world mission of the Church. But I want to begin not with the conference itself, but with an address given in Edinburgh 9 months later by the Scottish theologian Professor David S. Cairns. Now, Cairns had played a crucial role in the conference. He was chairman of one of its study commissions, Commission 4, which studied the missionary message in relation to non-Christian religions. And the deeply reflective report of that commission has been more extensively studied by modern scholars than have any of the Edinburgh 1910 documents because of its obvious interest to those concerned with interfaith issues today. So Cairns was the chairman of that report. In March 1911, on the 23rd of March, he was back in Edinburgh addressing a conference of Scottish students under the auspices of the Student Christian Movement. That was the British arm of the international Protestant student movement that was so closely linked to the Edinburgh Conference. The advertised subject of Cairns' address on the 23rd of March 1911 was the vocation of Scotland in view of her religious heritage. But Cairns devoted the substantial opening portion of his address to an analysis of the condition of the world, which might equally well have come from the lips or the pen of John R. Mott. Mott, of course, the American Methodist lay evangelist who chaired the World Missionary Conference and who chaired Commission 1 on carrying the gospel to all the non-Christian world. And the central preoccupations of Cairns' remarks in this opening section of his address to the Edinburgh students are almost identical to those which you will find in Mott's Commission 1 report, submitted to the Edinburgh Conference the year before. Cairns would undoubtedly have read Mott's report and evidently endorsed its principal arguments, though we don't need to posit Mott as the sole or even the primary influence on Cairns' address. Now, like Mott's Commission 1 report, Cairns, in his address, rapidly homed in on what was then known as the Orient, what he termed the dark continent of Africa. I'm sorry, there's a lot of politically incorrect terminology this evening. What he termed the dark continent of Africa and the advance of Islam were mentioned on the first page, but only to be summarily dismissed in favour of India and, above all, of the farthest east, for it is here that the interest is sharpest. Cairns observed that a strange tremor of unrest has suddenly spread across Asia, from Bombay to Mukden, Western India and Manchuria being two of the principal fields of Scottish Presbyterian missionary endeavour. These tremors were produced, he said, by the jarring encounter of two mighty tectonic forces. On the one hand, the ancient religions and civilizations of Asia, and on the other, the incursion of new cultural influences from the West. One of these was Christianity. But Cairns was in little doubt that the more potent disruptive influence was of a rather different kind. He said, wherever the new scientific knowledge comes throughout the Orient, there the ancestral faiths must wither and die. Those Eastern nations cannot assimilate the techniques of Western civilization and Western militarism without assimilating the scientific method on which these are based, and where the scientific method comes, the old faiths must sooner or later go. The real alternative that lies before China and Japan, if they persist on their present paths, must be between Christianity and secularism. The alarming prospect that Cairns was raising in the minds of his student audience was that East Asia would go over en masse to atheism, an outcome whose disastrous reaction, he said, would be felt throughout Christendom. The growing irreligion which British Christians lamented to find in their own society was as nothing in comparison with what would soon be observable if this great spiritual disaster comes to pass, if Christendom idly allows it to pass. Cairns believed that a certain instinct and divination of this portentous trend impelled the international student movement, of which this meeting was a part, and he noted the same conviction certainly lay behind the World Missionary Conference in this city of Edinburgh last June. The same conviction about the need to rescue East Asia from atheism. The vocation of Scotland in particular, and more broadly the calling of the Western Protestant churches as a whole, was nothing less than to halt and even reverse the downward slide of Asia, and East Asia in particular, towards a godless future that would prove deeply damaging to the global fortunes of Christianity. Scotland, with its great missionary tradition and its reformed theological emphasis on the absolute sovereignty of God over all areas of human activity, not accepting the turbulent waters of politics and ideology, was, according to Cairns, uniquely well placed to discharge the task. Cairns' message was distinctively shaped for a Scottish theological audience, but the essential priorities which he identified for global missionary strategy were a faithful replication of the central thrust of Mott's message to the Edinburgh Conference, as expressed especially in the Commission 1 report. Three unifying premises may be identified underlying both Cairns' address and Mott's report. And I want to examine these three assumptions in some detail and make some reference to how the subsequent course of world Christian history has either borne out or invalidated these assumptions. First of all, the religious impact of modernization. The first premise, evident in both Cairns' address and the Commission 1 report, was the assumption that the ancient religions of Asia were losing their hold on the educated elites who were being drawn to the modern and progressive ideologies emanating from the West. Modernization of education and economy, it was assumed, would inevitably lead to the disintegration of Asia's traditional faiths. This erosion of the religious foundations of Asian civilizations and the uniquely plastic condition, as Mott put it, of Asian nations constituted both opportunity and threat for Christianity. In China, as also in Korea, Japan, India, Turkey, and Persia, the question was whether the Church would be able to channel the strengthening currents of political, educational, and religious reform in the direction of Christianity. If the tide is not set towards Christianity during the next decade, both in the Far East and the Near East, it may be turned against us in the decade following. The report noted how the ancient Confucian society of China was turning from its conservative preoccupation with the traditions of the ancestors to a focus on the future. This was a trend that had impressed itself on John Mott during his third visit to China in 1907, when he had been struck by the hunger of China's student class to seize new educational opportunities abroad, especially in Tokyo. The Commission One report observed that thousands of ambitious Chinese youths were going to study in Japan, America, and Europe to prepare themselves for the leadership of the new China. Their appetite for Western education and scientific knowledge was, Mott argued, an invitation for missions to present the latest scientific truth along with the gospel, thus showing the Chinese that all truth is one, and leading them to accept the gospel sugared by a coating of Western scientism. The priority was therefore to expand greatly the Christian educational enterprise in China, following a policy that may be denominated as Christianity Plus. It is Western education that the Chinese are clamoring for and will have. If we can give it to them plus Christianity, they will take it. If we cannot give it to them, they will get it elsewhere without Christianity, and that speedily. Now, such widening exposure to Western learning did not, however, imply that China's long-standing tradition of anti-foreignism was about to evaporate. On the contrary, Mott discerned in the new national spirit coursing through China's educated classes a redoubled insistence on China for the Chinese, and a strengthening hostility to many aspects of foreign influence, a recognition that ought to have led Mott to question the assumption that education offered by the missions would inevitably lead to the acceptance of Christianity as part of the package. China, his report concluded, presented the spectacle of a great empire in a state of flux, a mass of plastic ideological metal lying inert in the furnace of revolutionary change, ready to be set in either a Christian or a materialist mold. The outcome would depend on what proper plant and force were at hand. In other words, on whether Christian missions were willing to devote sufficient personnel and resources to the furnace of a China in the midst of revolutionary change. Now, on one level, the diagnosis offered by the report proved to be extraordinarily accurate. It was not inconceivable in 1910 that the currents of modernizing reform and nationalist politics in various parts of Asia would flow over the next 2 to 3 decades in directions broadly sympathetic to Christianity. In India, until Gandhi's very public attack in 1936-7 on Christian proselytism as a threat to Indian national identity and Hindu tolerance, it was not wholly clear that the nationalist movement would take a strongly Hindu form, synthesizing India's ancestral faith with modern political ideologies in a way that neither Mott nor Cairns had contemplated. The so-called mass or people movements of Dalits, untouchables as they were then called, into Christianity maintained extraordinary momentum in the 2 decades after 1910. increasing the Christian population of India by an estimated 40% between the 1911 and 1931 censuses, far in excess of the rate of growth of the national population. However, in the wake of Gandhi's campaign against conversion, the rate of Christian expansion in India slowed. The famous declaration in 1935 of B.R. Ambedkar, spokesman for the Untouchables, that though born a Hindu, he would not die a Hindu, did not in fact raise widespread hopes that he might choose Christianity. And Ambedkar, of course, followed by hundreds of thousands of his followers, finally converted to Buddhism exactly 21 years later on the 14th of October, 1956. In China, on the other hand, Christian hopes remained buoyant for longer. Republican China under Sun Yat-sen adopted a broadly pro-Christian stance. And through the influence of the YMCA, the new Western-educated elite gravitated for a time towards Christianity. By 1922, the YMCA could claim 24,000 student members and a further 54,000 members of city associations throughout China. Sun Yat-sen's successor, Chiang Kai-shek, married a devout Methodist, Sun Mei-ling, in 1927, was baptized in October 1930, and became a regular Bible reader and man of prayer after his traumatic imprisonment by two rebel warlords at Xi'an in December 1936. It was not wholly foolish of missionary observers to imagine that he was China's greatest hope at the present time. Nevertheless, by 1927-8, the anti-Christian movements in China had confronted Christian missions with the uncomfortable fact that their promise of national self-strengthening and modernization through the medium of Christianity had been upstaged by an ideology of exactly the atheist variety of which Mott and Cairns had warned. Marxist-Leninism, despite being more Western, both in its origins and in its philosophical texture than was Christianity, appeared to offer the Chinese elite the same material benefits as did the Christianity Plus package marketed by the missions, but without the need to accept foreign tutelage and informal control. Protestant missions in Republican China continued to invest heavily in higher education and to present Christianity as the foundation of scientific progress. At Shandong Christian University in Jinan, the White Wright Institute and Museum, founded by the English Baptist missionary J.S. Whitewright in 1887, displayed the wonders of Western science in what Robert Speer hailed as the most effective piece of university extension work which can be found in Asia, if not in the world. However, the methodology of Christianity Plus was fundamentally flawed. China provides the most telling example of how Mott's analysis was both uncannily prescient, but at the same time dangerously unaware of the ultimate implications of the strategic emphases which he was urging Western missions to adopt. The second premise underlying the missionary strategy, outlined in the Commission report and in Cairns's address, was that missionary effort should be concentrated on those portions of humanity that were deemed to have the greatest collective vitality and hence maximal potential to influence others, either towards the acceptance of Christianity or its rejection. And here the influence of contemporary racial theory, tinged as it was with social Darwinist connotations, was implicit and occasionally made explicit. The Chinese, observed the report, were the opposite of certain decaying races with which missions also have to do. Their energy and endurance made them hard to win, certainly, but decidedly worth winning. A similar verdict was applied to the Japanese, whose advanced state of mental, moral, and material civilization was said to make them the natural leaders of the Orient. Japan was already the dominant power in the Korean peninsula. Within 2 months of the conclusion of the Edinburgh Conference on the 22nd of August 1910, Japan would annex Korea as a formal colony. The evangelization of Japan was thus an urgent imperative, not simply for the sake of its own inhabitants, but also because this ascendant Asian colonial power, in its growing rationalism and materialism, posed a potential threat to what the report described as the childlike faith of Korean Protestants. Koreans were characterized as a childlike race whose ready acceptance of Christianity was a cause for celebration, but also potential anxiety that they might prove equally ready to accept a rationalistic creed from their dominant neighbor. And as for the races which were branded as not merely childlike but decaying, and I'm afraid Africans were in mind here, they too needed the gospel urgently, but for precisely the opposite reason to that which impelled evangelism in China or Japan. African traditional systems of belief, labelled by the report as animism or fetishism, were, it was confidently predicted, destined to succumb within a generation to the first higher monotheistic religion with which they came into contact. In the light of the threatening advance of Islam into equatorial Africa, the only question, therefore, was whether the dark continent shall become Mohammedan or Christian. African religion, it was said, had no future. Paganism is doomed. In introducing its section on Africa, the report made in passing the telling comment that India and China were the two great mission fields of the world, and proceeded, as if in justification of this statement, to note the sparse nature of Africa's population, which was computed to be less than 15 persons per square mile in comparison to China's ratio of over 260 to the square mile. Now, Mott expressed confidence that under, he said, more settled and propitious conditions in the future, by which he meant the British Empire, the meagre population of Africa would increase enormously. Nevertheless, he was pessimistic about the survival of what he called African primitivism, which he saw as constituting peculiarly fertile soil for conversion. There are but a few primitive races or peoples left in the world, and the opportunity afforded the Christian church to reach them under most favorable conditions can last but a brief season. Africa thus had insistent claims of its own to make on the allocation of Western missionary resources, and even the occasional missionary voice from Asia was prepared to recognize this. D.E. Host, the British director of the China Inland Mission, urged in his questionnaire reply, which we have upstairs, that the situation in Africa constitutes perhaps the most urgent call upon the Christian church at the present time. The record of existing well-organized work in Africa, Host believed, indicated that it would probably be comparatively easy to win the rest. The Commission 1 report concluded that the African continent offered the prospect and indeed the necessity of an imminent battle with Islam for the soul of traditional religionists, and even of rapid and widespread triumphs of the gospel. However, Mott appeared to believe that the strategic significance of Africa for the global future of Christianity was limited. This may have been because he was ambivalent about the likely future trajectory of Islam. Although the Commission 1 report warned delegates of the aggressive nature of Muslim expansion in Africa, Malaya, Sumatra, and of the resurgence of Indian Islam, particularly amongst low-caste groups, paradoxically, it also informed them that globally Islam was making no marked intellectual or spiritual progress. The religion, they were assured, was disintegrating philosophically, into competing sects and parties lacking in creative energy and struggling to retain the allegiance of Muslims who were attracted to the modern learning. Here Mott reflected the optimistic views expressed by the leading American advocate of missions to the Muslim world, Samuel Zwemer. Zwemer had written in 1907 that Islam as a religion was doomed to fade away in time before the advance of humanity, civilization, and enlightenment. You see, if Islam had no long-term future, the significance of the short-term religious contest in Africa, however urgent and fiercely contested it might be, was relativized. One wonders how Mott or Zwemer would have reacted to the statistics published earlier this year in a remarkable book, The Atlas of Global Christianity, published by Edinburgh University Press, which estimate that over the century since 1910, the average annual rate of growth of Islam worldwide has been 1.97% compared with 1.33% for Christianity. So much for imminent disintegration. They might have been rather less surprised and more gratified to learn that in Africa, on the other hand, the rate of Christian growth over the century, 3.82%, has surpassed the rate of Muslim growth, 2.38%, with an ease that confounds the more pessimistic predictions made in 1910 that Africa stood on the brink of becoming a Muslim continent. What Mott, along with almost all of the delegates at Edinburgh in 1910, would have struggled to understand is that traditional African approaches to the spirit world were not so comprehensively doomed in the face of encroaching modern enlightenment as they anticipated, but rather have been incorporated and substantially recrafted within a Christian framework. It's not easy for our generation that has come to make an almost automatic mental association between Africa and the missionary to appreciate that only a century ago the continent of Africa was still of distinctly secondary importance to India, the jewel in the imperial crown in the minds of British missionary thinkers, and of even more marginal significance to most American Protestant missionary strategists, whose attentions, like those of their compatriots who harbored imperialist aspirations, were firmly fixed on the Pacific Rim. The Statistical Atlas of Christian Missions, prepared for the Edinburgh Conference by Commission One at great expense as a companion to the report, revealed that there were more North American foreign missionaries working in Japan than in the whole of the African continent, 769 to 734. In East, Southeast, and South Asia as a whole, there were nearly 7 times as many North American Protestant missionaries as there were in Africa. In Britain, the disproportion between Asia and Africa was less marked, though still significant. The Atlas suggested, you'll see that about 4,500 British missionaries were working in East, Southeast, and South Asia as compared with 2,200 or so in Africa. After the First World War, these ratios would begin to reverse, as the political conditions for missionary work in parts of Asia, notably China, deteriorated in the force of ascendant nationalist movements, while conversely, missionary opportunities in Africa steadily expanded under the umbrella of colonial protection and educational subsidies. The number of Protestant missionary personnel serving in Asia decreased markedly from 16,663 in 1925 to 14,318 in 1938, whereas those serving in Africa showed a significant increase. After the Second World War, the transposition of Western missionary priorities became more marked as the doors closed to Western missions first in China and then in much of the Indian subcontinent. The corresponding reorientation to tropical Africa was most marked in the case of American conservative, evangelical, or fundamentalist missions, although Catholic missions also contributed to the geographical shift. By 2010, according to the Atlas of Global Christianity, the number of North American missionaries, this time including Catholics working in Africa, had reached 53,100, nearly 10 times as many as those working in Asia, and even eclipsing the substantial American missionary presence in Latin America. In terms of North American missionary numbers, the Atlas suggests that Asia now ranks below even Oceania, while missionaries from Europe working in Africa also outnumber those working in Asia. It's interesting to note that European missions are now numerically a more significant presence in Asia than American ones, a total reversal of what had been the distribution. And I think it's particularly sobering to observe that this striking geographical reconcentration of Western missionary forces over the last century has followed rather than initiated trends in the growth of world Christianity. Whether by political necessity or strategic choice, or a combination of the two, Western missions over the last century have refocused their attention on the continent where Christianity has taken independent root most easily, and have largely abandoned the goal that was uppermost in the minds of strategists in 1910, the endeavor to capture the political and religious elites of Asia for Christ before they succumbed to the rival attractions of Western materialist ideologies. For European Protestants from the era of Ziegenbalg onwards, the beginning of the 18th century, the river of Christian mission had flowed primarily from west to east. This was because the first Protestant missions to establish themselves as imperial powers, Denmark, the Netherlands, Britain, turned their attention increasingly to Asia and away from their initial preoccupation with the Caribbean and the Americas. And British and European Protestant missionary priorities increasingly followed suit, especially after the achievement of slave emancipation in the British Empire in 1833-4, which was followed with almost indecent haste by the withdrawal of most British missionary societies from the Caribbean. American Protestants made this Oriental preoccupation their own, but with a distinctive geographical emphasis on both the eastern rim of Asia and the western rim of Asia, not so much on the Indian subcontinent that absorbed so much British missionary energy. Americans, of course, also devoted substantial missionary resources to their southern continental neighbor, Latin America. The decision to exclude from the Edinburgh Conference agenda all missions aimed at historic, Catholic, Orthodox, or Oriental Christian populations, decision taken in April 1909 in deference to the scruples of Anglo-Catholics, was a bitter pill for American evangelicals to swallow. So a large portion of their mission field was deleted from the agenda. The forcible severance in 1910 of Latin America from other fields of Protestant missionary activity had the effect of reinforcing still more strongly the unspoken equations in the minds, certainly of European Protestants, between Christian and Western, non-Christian and Eastern. Only gradually, in the course of the 20th century, as the balance of mission resources shifted from Asia to Africa, and as Latin American missions elbowed their way back onto the ecumenical Protestant agenda after the 1916 Panama Congress on Christian work in Latin America, only then did the old Orientalist juxtapositions of religious geography begin to fade, to be supplanted initially by a new vertical ideological juxtaposition between Christian North and non-Christian South. But this, in its turn, gradually inverted itself from the 1970s onwards into a third and diametrically opposite antithesis, which has now become a truism of religious studies discourse, namely the opposition between post-Christian North and new Christian South. Third assumption, Indigenous agency and appropriation. The third premise, discernible both in Cairns's address and in John Mott's report, was the tacit assumption that Christians from the non-Western world had only a subsidiary, though perhaps important, part to play in shaping the future of world Christianity. Now, there were speakers at Edinburgh who articulated a bold, if loosely defined, vision of what the face of future world Christianity might look like. It would not, they said, be a monochrome replication of Western styles, but a truly Catholic and universal family, which would incorporate, for example, distinctively Chinese or Japanese or Indian expressions of Christian truth and worship. Most notable in this respect was the Anglo-Catholic Anglican Archbishop of Birmingham, Charles Gore, chairman of Commission 3 on Christian Education, whose report insisted that the final eschatological vision held out by the New Testament in Revelation chapter 21 was a vision of all nations bringing the gifts of their distinctive racial characteristics into the inclusive community of the city of God. But the efforts made at Edinburgh by folk like Gore to articulate a theology of legitimate plurality within the Catholicity of the global household of God were patchy and were founded on dubious notions of racial essentialism. They were rarely, if ever, extended to those races deemed to be primitive. They featured only minimally in Mott's activist program of winning the world through a program of evangelization led by Western missionary agencies. Both Cairns and Mott conceived of global evangelization as a movement which ultimately depended on the standards of Christian spirituality and zeal set within Europe and North America. Indeed, the implicit but touchingly bold claim of Cairns's address in 1911 was that it was the wee nation of Scotland, with its particular inheritance of Reformed theology, democratic education, and missionary enthusiasm, whom God was calling to play a pivotal role in the divine strategy for the salvation of Asia's countless millions. To be fair, the Commission 1 report did, as the quotation on the slide makes clear, pay homage to the necessary role of Asian and African Christians in the task of evangelization. It called in particular for the more effective training of catechists, evangelists, and Bible women, figures who would be of central importance in the growth of popular Christianity in Asia and Africa over the next century. However, the very next paragraph of the report went on to assert, quote, that a crucial factor in the evangelization of the non-Christian world is the state of the church in Christian lands. The missionary movement would only become irresistible and triumphant, was the phrase, if there was a higher level of spiritual consecration among members of what the report termed the home church. The opening chapter of the report had also revealed its presuppositions by drawing a comparison between the expansion of African Islam, which was essentially the work of indigenous agents, and Christianity, where it was said, until a force of native workers can be prepared, Christianity must be spread by Europeans who differ greatly from the natives. Now, although the comparison was not without foundation, even as early as 1910, this statement represented a serious undervaluation of the place that indigenous Christians already occupied in the process of evangelization in fields such as Uganda or Yorubaland. The largest British mission agency, the Church Missionary Society, had in 1906 nearly 10 times as many accredited native agents, 8,850, as it had European missionaries, 975. Even observers of global religious trends in 1910 to 11, as perceptive as Mott or Cairns undoubtedly were, made no essential distinction between the future of the Western missionary movement and the future of world Christianity. For the latter, they assumed, would be fundamentally dependent on and coextensive with the former. 100 years later, it is patently obvious to us that these two global religious processes have proved to be, though not entirely unrelated, clearly separable and often markedly divergent. We are well aware that the players who scarcely made it onto the cast list at the World Missionary Conference in 1910 have proved to be among the key actors in the subsequent transformation of Christianity into a religion that is rooted increasingly in the cultural soil of the Southern Hemisphere. African American missionaries, Pentecostals, prophets, prophetesses, and African-initiated churches feature hardly at all in the Edinburgh reports. There were at least 6, perhaps 8 or even more African American delegates present at Edinburgh. They even convened a separate caucus meeting for all-coloured delegates during the conference, which was advertised in the conference daily paper, though we do not know who turned up to the meeting. The Commission reports, however, give relatively little attention to the role of African American missions in the evangelization of West Africa, for example. Pentecostals were becoming increasingly visible on the Christian stage by 1910, but since their growing presence as individuals scattered in different locations throughout the world was not yet formalized into separate Pentecostal missionary agencies, they did not qualify for representation at Edinburgh. And as for the first African-initiated churches, the only mention they receive in Mott's report was of a sweepingly dismissive kind. The Ethiopian churches of South Africa are described as a mischief spreading through the country, a superficial and largely emotional form of Christianity, unable to resist the disintegrating and corrupting influences of surrounding heathenism. Nevertheless, the report did include a section specifically devoted to organized evangelistic work on the part of the native churches. It took due note of such non-Western missionary initiatives as the West African missions of Jamaican Presbyterians and Anglicans, V.S. Azara's National Missionary Society of India and the Indian Missionary Society of Tinnevelly, or the Telugu Baptist Natal Mission, whose first overseas missionary to the indentured sugarcane workers on the plantations of Natal, John Rangia, was a delegate at Edinburgh of the American Baptist Foreign Missionary Society, an Indian sent as a missionary to Africa by an Indian missionary agency 100 years ago. Or the report also noted the earliest ventures by Korean Protestants to spread the gospel among the Korean diaspora in locations such as Jeju, Kwalpat Island, Siberia, Manchuria, and even Hawaii and California. Missions from what would now be termed the Global South were thus already in evidence by 1910, and were warmly welcomed by Mott, even if he could not refrain from adding as a concluding comment that in most of the cases referred to above, it should be noted that the counsel and guidance of the European missionaries have been fraternally asked and fraternally given. Contrary to what is often alleged, Edinburgh 1910 did not confine its definition of missions to Western endeavours, but it did assume that Western leadership of the whole enterprise was both appropriate and destined to remain intact for the foreseeable future. What can we say in conclusion? Well, both David Cairns and John Mott were men of intelligence, insight, perhaps exceptional breadth of vision. In varying measure, these qualities were shared by other leaders and delegates of the World Missionary Conference. In their perception that the leading nations of Asia were in an unusually plastic condition, peculiarly amenable at this pivotal point in their history to being moulded by powerful ideologies from various quarters, they were not far wrong. But at the same time, their field of vision had a number of serious blind spots. In the long term, Christianity would suffer more than it gained from the attempts of missions to yoke its message to Western scientific values and progress. They underestimated the capacity of the ancient faiths of Asia to retain their hold even on modern, urban, and educated people. They also seriously misjudged the capacity of Islam to survive and even flourish within a modern environment. They had very little sense of how far the future of world Christianity was to be shaped by African and other indigenous peoples whom they labelled as decaying, primitive, and devoid of the requisite cultural resources to articulate their own distinctive incarnations of the Christian gospel. So they had their blind spots. Nevertheless, I have a suspicion that if the proceedings of the various centennial missionary conferences that have been held this year in Edinburgh, in Tokyo, in Cape Town, and then over the last few days at the Boston Theological Institute, if the proceedings of those mission conferences were to be subjected in 100 years' time to critical dissection by scholars in the light of the course that world Christianity has actually taken in the 21st century, I suspect that the diagnoses and policy prescriptions advanced in these conferences of our own generation will prove to be no less flawed, no less partial in perception, no less ideologically conditioned than those of our predecessors a century ago. Ultimately, our responses to the pronouncements made in 1910 will depend on our own theological and philosophical commitments. For all of their Western cultural biases, the delegates at Edinburgh 1910 shared a common conviction that the gospel of Christ was good news for all human beings without exception, and therefore was not to be confined within the frontiers of European or American Christendom. This theological absolutism, if we want to call it that, so uncongenial to many palates today, was in fact the foundation for the construction of Christianity as what it is today, a multicultural world religion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have time for just a couple of questions if you're harboring any. We would ask if you have a question that you state it pretty loudly because we don't have any mics here for you. So you might want to repeat any that aren't heard well so that we're on the electronic media. It was a lot to take in, wasn't it? John.
Brian, you've been in the individual position in the past few months in being able to attend the Edinburgh Conference celebration and also a number of other conferences related to this. I'd be interested to hear the reflections on any leitmotifs or themes that you hear running through reflections not only on the conference in 1910, but maybe the redux of that in 2010, looking ahead 100 years. Do you pick up discernible trends in the conversation?
I think the question is what are the outstanding trends that emerge from the conferences held this year marking the centenary? I think the biggest contrast to 1910, or one of the biggest contrasts, is in 1910 they didn't talk about theology. Everybody assumed they knew what Christianity was. The only question was how you should propagate it. and questions of faith and order were deliberately kept off the agenda in 1910. That was the way in which they hoped they would keep everybody on board, but it also reflected this sort of undisturbed consensus within the Protestant world, broadly evangelical world. We all know what Christianity is. It's simply a case of how to target the message most effectively. In contrast, in 2010, most of the time is actually spent arguing about what Christian mission means in a pluralist world. Well, it was pluralist in 1910, but we're much more aware of it now, perhaps. Pluralism is now on our doorstep. It's not over there. That's the big difference. So a lot of time has been spent on trying to rescue some sense of what is integral and central to Christian mission without doing an injustice to religious integrity of those of other faiths. And you can imagine that not everybody agrees in the way in which that conundrum is approached. That's probably the biggest difference, and many others as well. I mean, looking back 100 years and having been involved in organising a much smaller event in Edinburgh this time with only 300 rather than the 1,200 they had, 1,200 plus in 1910, I must say I have enormous admiration for J.H. Oldham, who organised the 1910 conference without email, without jet travel, and it went like clockwork, whereas we had email and we had jet travel. Well, I won't tell you, but we had a few issues. Yes?
Yeah, I'm wrong, but I think I got from your presentation that there was some semblance of absence in the Asian context. These missionaries trusted Christianity at that time, focusing on Asia, specifically Far East.
Yeah.
Was there any reason for the movement that neglected that part of the world? Were they not receptive to the philosophical aspects of Christianity? I may be wrong.
You're asking whether since 1910?
Yeah. No, during the Edinburgh conference,
Right.
It seems that when your staff indicated there were less present in that part of the world. I'm wondering why we focus more on that than we have.
No, they're very considerable presence in East Asia. I mean, comparative to the size of a Japanese population, a very large missionary presence in Japan, a very large missionary presence in China, a rapidly growing American missionary presence in Korea. So in fact, there's a very close correlation between American strategic concerns with East Asia, American economic interests in East Asia, because a great deal of American trade is focused on East Asia at this time, and a rapidly growing proportion, and the missionary concerns. What they're neglecting is Africa. Relatively few American missions involved in Africa, compared with post-Second World War, where the American investment in Africa is enormous in Christian terms. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one about the relationship between politics and theology of mission.
Yeah.
I want to know, in your understanding, the history of mission. Let's say, what's the mission of Christianity, an instrument of this politics of colonialization, and how do you think about contemporary theology of mission? Because nowadays in the ecumenical dialogue we have a theology of recognition of the other, and also recognition of our own perspective way of understanding of the world and the presence of God. So the future of Christianity is not the mission, but it is God in His Trinitarian communion. So our future is the Creator, not we are making our future by numbers and so on. How can we contribute nowadays to this healing of memories through cultural dialogue and let's say there is indeed a scene in the history, and I was shocked about your presentation. But I think that there is still hope there. I propose an ecumenical anthropology to recognize the dignity of the other as item of image. But maybe you have some other, let's say, another hopeful perspectives, because ecumenism is also an ecumenism of spirituality, not only ecumenism.
Well, there's a lot of issues there, and we can't begin, I think, to unpack them all. In terms of the relationship of the missionary movement to colonialism, there are two sides to the coin. Yes, on the face of it, you look at the Edinburgh reports and the questionnaire responses, and they are saturated in the language and perspectives of colonialism, and yet there is some very forthright, indignant criticism of the British Empire by both British and American missionaries, particularly in areas of Islamic predominance. Because the British Empire worked by indirect rule, it worked through Muslim agents, and in practice that meant the British Empire did more to spread Islam than it did to spread Christianity in areas like Sudan and northern Nigeria. So they're deeply unhappy about that. They're deeply unhappy about moral issues, the red rubber atrocities in the Congo and so on. Christian thinking accepted the basic principle of empire, but so did socialist thinking, by the way, at the time. It was very critical of the conduct of empire. The wider issue of how we construct a theology focused on the Missio Dei, and one that takes proper concern of the integrity and dignity of the other, and yet still, I would want to say, asserts that Christ's love and the good news of Christ's message still extends to that other, that's what all these conferences have been wrestling with, and that's where there is enormous work still to be done. Sorry, that's hardly beginning to touch on big issues. But thank you for the question.
One last.
I'm just so curious. I'm going to have to get your book now because I'm so curious if the Anglo-Catholics were that powerful. They didn't beat Latin America.
Oh, yeah. Well, you have to understand British ecclesiastical politics, I think. It's all to do with Anglican politics, and Oldham is desperately concerned he must have the Church of England in its full breadth on board if this is to be a really significant and powerful conference that will attract general support and respect, and therefore it cannot just have the evangelicals as previous missionary conferences had done. There have been previous missionary conferences, including one in New York in 1900. Yeah, but only evangelicals came. The Anglo-Catholics didn't come. The key thing about Edinburgh is the Anglo-Catholics are on board, the full range of the Church of England, and so they effectively hold a gun to Oldham's head, and they say, if you include in the statistics, and it was actually focused on the statistics, if you include in the statistics work done by American Protestant missions in Latin America or among Orthodox or Oriental Christian populations, we will withdraw. And Oldham was so anxious that he made a special trip to New York to try and sort it out. So you can read about it in the book.
Thank you very, very much. Well, that's it for tonight, but we'll be here again with another interesting lecture, and I hope to see you all then. February 17th is the date, and it has to do with a new translation or commentary.
Critique of the history of the introduction to the Bible within publishing circles. There are two scholars from religious studies departments, one in Florida and one in Texas, who are working on a new type of introduction to the Bible. that critiques previous approaches to this. Among them, Bart Ehrman's introduction of the year, there's a trenchant critique of his work applied to this. It's fascinating. They're working out of the history of Union Theological Seminary and saying that the history of Union Theological Seminary, biblical criticism, going back to the mid-19th century, has something to teach contemporary biblical studies today about how the Bible should be introduced to students at the college level, high school level, and graduate. So, thank you very much.
Look forward to seeing you then. Good night, and please do join us. Become a member of the Friends of the Library. We'll appreciate it.